Welcome to another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns with the University Innovation Alliance.
And I am Sara Custer, Editor-in-Chief at Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, we team up to have a conversation with a leader in the field that we think you should be listening to. We're looking for leaders whose voices we think need to be brought to the conversation. We think they have interesting perspective, but also we recognize that it's super helpful to have some insightful and uplifting perspective on a Monday. That's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom.
And Weekly Wisdom is sponsored by Mainstay. Discussions on making change easier and more impactful are a recurring theme on Weekly Wisdom. Mainstay supports this by streamlining student communication, automating routine interactions, and providing actionable insights so that institutions can implement change effectively without adding to administrative burdens. Explore further at mainstay.com.
The show is also later ported to our podcast, the Innovating Together podcast, which is sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. We are always grateful for their generous support. But now, drum roll, please. Super excited, running on the stage to bring John Fry, who we are so excited as the newest president of Temple University, but who also has a very long and interesting, distinguished career. You were a prior president at Drexel, so not too far away. But I also love that you were a management consultant way back and actually advised and helped support universities navigating complex issues. So there's just I think there's just a very interesting background. I've never met anyone like you. So, and the fact that you went from a private to a quasi-public. So thank you so much for coming. And we hope that you can share with us some insights.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Sara.
I would just start by how did that, this is a very different background. It is not, department head, chair, dean, provost, president, just the same track. I find it super interesting, your interest in higher ed so early from the outside. Why would you want to do these jobs when you actually have way more insight? As a consultant, you saw how hard these were. I'm just so curious, what brought you here?
Yeah, well, I've had really, at this point, unfortunately, a long but really lucky and serendipitous career. I started in management consulting, worked my way up to becoming a partner at Coopers & Lybrand, whose successor firm is PwC. So I ran the national higher education consulting practice for a number of years. And then the worst thing that can ever happen to a consultant is you're asked to implement your own recommendations. And that's what they asked me to do with the University of Pennsylvania back in 1995. So I went from being a partner at Coopers to becoming the COO at the University of Pennsylvania. Worked for my first great mentor, Judy Roden, for 7 years, then went on to become president of Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a small private liberal arts college, much like the one I went to, which was Lafayette. And I did that super happily for 8 years, and then on to Drexel University in Philadelphia for 14 years as president. And now I'm a rookie again at Temple University, just finishing up my first year. So it has been serendipitous. It's always been different and challenging, every institution. And honestly, it's just been an amazing, lucky 30-year career for me.
You have so many presidencies that I forgot one of them. That's how experienced you are. I've totally forgot about Franklin and Marshall. I think I don't know of any other president right now who has this much vantage point on the job. I think it's really, really interesting.
I'm curious to know, in all of the time that you spent kind of working in the ecosystem of institutions and kind of looking at them from the outside, when you finally did go inside, what sort of assumptions did you have to kind of learn from? I mean, were there surprises? Were there things that you thought were true, and once you got in, you're like, oh, actually, no, I got that totally wrong?
Yeah, it was so much harder. Giving advice is a walk in the park compared to actually having to figure out how to get the advice turned into something that would, have, meaning. And so I remember that first year at Penn thinking I thought I knew a lot about higher ed, and I didn't really know all that much about the practical part, which is, making change and getting results and moving an institution forward. So I think that was probably the biggest thing. I thought I was prepared. Maybe I was intellectually prepared, but certainly just in terms of the things you have to do to get things, done in these places, it took me a while to get up the learning curve on that. And then I think just sort of dealing with a very different culture of how to make decisions. I was used to making decisions, quickly and sort of forcing the pace. And I had to figure out how to do those things because I wasn't going to slow down decision making and not force the pace, but how to do it in a way in an institutional setting where people just sort of think about time in a very different way. So I think that was the other major adjustment, is how to keep it going, but do it in a way that was respectful and also had the sort of long game in mind. And by the way, that's something I struggle with to this very day. It's always been the case that, to me, time is the greatest thing that I have to sort of deal with in terms of challenges. Keeping things moving forward, and at the same time really trying to bring people along. So there's a sense that we're in this together and we're going to try to build something enduring.
I'm curious about, so you've come in and you've figured out how to navigate with that difficulty of the time. Like, there are just so many people report to you. Everyone you interact with wants something from you or works for you. And navigating through all of that to figure out what are the key decisions to make and how to move things forward, knowing that your calendar is back to back in probably 15-minute increments. And at the end of the day, you have a delicious dinner of emails that have been building up all day waiting for you. I'm curious about if there are any insights from looking at the outside of the, advising leaders, but also because you've done this now a few times. I'm always so interested when people actually do their email and how they actually balance the load. But I'm just curious if there are any tips or tricks that you have figured out trying and make these jobs more sustainable.
Well, when I went to Penn, I was 34. I literally knew nothing about what it was like to work inside of an institution, but I was younger and had a lot of energy and was really determined to sort of prove to my boss, Judy Roden, who hired me, sort of against my advice, by the way, that's another story, that I could actually rise to the occasion and meet her very, very high expectations. But 30 years later, it's like, physically it's different. And so what and this will sound like impossibly simple-minded, but what I've discovered in the end that, a really good hard workout every morning, like reasonable time with your spouse and trying to play it as normal as you can before you get to the starting line is super important. If I didn't have those couple of hours first thing in the morning now, I would be cooked by 3:00.
Yeah.
But the fact is, I'm 3:00. I'm just getting warmed up. I'm not usually done, and like most people who do my job until 8 or 9 at night. So it's different now because I have to go longer, even though I'm older, and it's important to stay fresh, which means you need to do things for yourself. So my advice to anyone coming onto one of these jobs is have a really good routine, like really be connected to your friends and family, because while those may seem like time indulgences, like, during the day, they are absolute necessities if you're going to run like what is always a really long race year after year. And by sticking to that routine, I've managed to sort of, get through it and, and feel really good at the end of the day and excited about going back, for the next one.
That's so good. And so it's so, like, I know it's easy, but it's like, yeah, no, honestly, it's true. If you're going to have any reflection or calm, peaceful time, it's only happening in the morning.
Right.
I don't know how people, if you're not an early riser, like, you just miss out because at some point the email's going to hit you in the face and you're done. Your priorities are out the door.
Yeah, and it's nice at 5 a.m. because it's peaceful. No one is after you at 5 a.m. And if you have a couple hours to get your things done and get a little bit of reading in, and that's really important.
Yeah, the mornings are sacred. I want to talk a little bit more about just kind of this conversation between the private sector and higher education. And we know, and you are definitely aware of industry leaders being involved in higher education, and especially I'm thinking about governing boards. What have you seen that maybe higher education leaders misunderstand about how they think the private sector views them?
Well, I think the only way to really understand that is to be in the private sector. So one of the things I've tried to do since I kind of got going professionally was to um, join boards, sit on the other side of the table from
Yeah.
the side I'm usually used to sitting on, really try to understand the perspective of people who are directors or trustees or donors or civic leaders or mayors or city council people, and spend a lot of time with them, because the more time you spend absorbing what they're thinking about, what they're concerned about, what they like, the more you figure out how do I translate all that into something that could be my institution's competitive advantage. So I've always put a premium on volunteering, on really being engaged civically. And again, not because I have all sorts of free time, but I viewed it as like street cred, and also really trying to anticipate what the critique was going to be and what the expectations were going to be. And so in Philadelphia in particular, I've spent a lot of time. I'm on the Federal Reserve, Bank of Philadelphia. I'm on the Chamber of Commerce board. I was the chair of the chamber. And while again, those are big commitments in time, but the perspective you get from sitting in all those rooms across the city and the region, visiting Harrisburg on a regular basis as well as DC, you come back with so much more perspective on what people are hoping for in their colleges and universities. And I think it's really helped me lead, and I think benefited my institutions as well.
And would you say that in those circles, you feel higher education is understood in a way that is satisfying to you?
I think people are often perplexed about like the operating model, the sort of, they don't really understand shared governance the way we would understand it, and why there's actually so many benefits to it. I think they are frustrated by the pace or lack thereof in decision making. They feel these places, don't necessarily operate as 12-month businesses like they're used to. They have these, long periods of high activity, and then they sort of die down, and people are off for, 3-4 months at a time. I think the culture is sort of considered a little bit precious, and I think people resent that. And then they look at the price and they're like, "Wow, how could you possibly, get real value out of that?" And so I think that there's a frustration, but that's always been that way. I think maybe more lately now, and with much more intensity, given the politics of our country right now.
I do think that your approach to showing up in a different way is a very strategic move that people should listen to, because part of this is not necessarily the output from higher ed, which we are, there's no shortage of things that we are going to promote and talk about and amplify. But we often are showing up in our legislators' offices or, in key meetings when it's time to ask for money. And we are not a partner in any of the deliberations that actually lead to the downstream effect of that money. So, we're there for showing up when it's about appropriations, when it's about investment, asking, but we don't help them wrestle with the decision to take people's walkers away, which is actually directly connected to whether or not there's going to be funding for higher ed, right? That we are not, nothing is happening in a vacuum, and that we often as institutions operate like this is our job, to stay in our lane, to do our thing. And we create a lot of impact, and we're going to tell you about it right before we ask you for resources. And then the rest of these things that you're dealing with, even though we have academic researchers doing things on like advancing knowledge and we're trying to solve them, we're going to let you handle them. Like that's one of the things I keep picking up.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really helped me, spending most of my 20s, running a business, was two things. One was having a P&L and, really having to sort of, run a business. And number two is having clients who, if they didn't want to, employ us anymore, meant that we didn't have a business. And this thing about clients, I mean, I think I learned from an early age that if I don't have a satisfied client, on the other end of what I'm doing, I don't have anything, and there's no work.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of the sort of perspective I've had is, these are my clients, the elected officials, the donors, the alumni, my faculty, my deans. I had 2 meetings today with 2 of my deans, one-on-ones, went to their offices, and I consider them my clients. My job is to make sure that they have what they need to, to bring forward the kind of, aspirations they have for their colleges. And so I've adopted that mentality. And I think, especially from a civic standpoint, in my role now, my role at Drexel in particular, I was making my way around the region saying, how are we doing in terms of supplying talent to your organizations, or research and insight that helps you advance, what you're doing. So I very much took the mode that these are my clients. I am here to serve them. And yeah, occasionally I'm going to need to ask them for stuff, and I'm going to need their help. But for every favor, I ask them, I'm gonna do 5 in return.
I love it. Client services approach. This is good. I want to pivot to more about you specifically as a leader. So, John, I'm just curious, like, who has most informed, or what experience has most directly informed whatever your approach to leadership is? Because everyone has a personal way of leading. Like, I'm just curious where that came from, and what, if you have an approach.
Yeah, I thought about that question, and honestly, and again, like a very sort of like simple-minded answer. I was a student athlete, and so I ran cross country and track, and I played varsity tennis. And early on, I got elected captains of these various sports, and I had to lead. I was sort of clueless about how to lead, but for better or for worse, they asked me to be the captain, and I had to figure out how to do that. And honestly, it may seem obscure, but the experience running cross country was actually the most profound, because the way cross country works, there are teams of 7, the first 5 score, and the goal is to get the lowest score, not the highest score, because in these races, there are 200, 300, 400 participants, and the lowest numbers added up, win the match, or the meet. And so if you are, running with 4 other teammates, your job is to, run together and run as a pack and stay together, because if you can pull everyone along, particularly the slower runners, you'll have a lower score. I could win the race, and if my teammates finish, 399, 400, 401, 402, I may win the race, but everyone on the team, collectively is going to lose. And so I remember early on thinking, wow, we have to work as a pack. We have to, encourage each other, push each other along. Who cares if we don't get a medal? The big medal we want is the team medal, which means, we have to sort of coalesce and, again, help each other along. And that was, I don't know, that had a really important impact on me, because I feel like to this very day, less like a president and more like a player coach, where like I'm in the work with them, and we do the work together. And, I have certain responsibilities, but so do they, and theirs are as important as mine are. And so I think being exposed to that at a young age, and, really having to figure out how to make, the sort of most of myself as a leader, but also as someone who was directly participating in the work, had the most impact on me.
Love it. You already answered our other question, which was like the undergraduate experience that most, prepared you for your career. But I love this, because this is the stuff that we don't get the credit for as a sector, but it is that like skill development that helps you be successful in life.
Yeah. And the experience that most prepared me for my career in college was I got elected to student government. I became student government president. I sat on the board, and I watched how these places worked. And I mean, to me, it was, first of all, it was an honor to be even asked to do any of those jobs, but like getting to know what a board of trustees does, and seeing how people poured themselves into that institution, how generous they were, how much time they put into it, with no expectation, maybe other than the occasional, nice event. I mean, it captivated me. It made me really want to work in these places, because I saw what a sort of selfless thing everyone was doing. And, that was, it was an enterprise that they felt so strongly about, that they loved so much. And I remember thinking to myself at 20 or 21, wow, this is the kind of thing I would like to do one day.
I had no idea that you had the same background. That's the same background as mine. Like nerd respects nerd, like
Yes,
game respects
exactly.
game. Yes. Okay.
I think we've just got a couple of minutes left, John. So one of my favorite questions that we ask people is what book you would recommend, or one that you most often recommend about leadership?
Or just that help that you would you find yourself most often recommending to people.
So I'm sitting in my my conference room. I have all my books imported to Temple, and I read about leaders, and it doesn't really actually matter what kind of leaders they are. I just like to read about leaders because I like to learn what their experience was, whether it was in politics or in academia or in business or in arts and culture. And so I read a lot of biographies. On this shelf up here, I have all my favorite Theodore Roosevelt books. And just a person of like endless fascination for me, just the way he sort of worked his way up and got into politics and the way he led, some of which I would agree with and some of which I wouldn't, but just the sort of character study. So that's mostly what I do.
Great. What is the best advice someone ever gave you that you most frequently draw upon?
That's a great question. I think it has something to do with that, being fearless enough to take on the really hard long-term challenges, knowing that if you try and fail, you have no regrets, and if you succeed, you can build something big. And I don't think I got that as advice, but again, I was very influenced by Judy Roden, who was the president of Penn from '94 to 2004. She hired me, and I remember watching her lead just so fiercely and fearlessly, and just she'd be in certain meetings or we'd be doing certain things, and I was like, where does she get the courage from? Just like staking stuff out and just going for it. And I remember thinking, she's just not afraid. She doesn't care, and she's not thinking about failing. She's thinking about doing. And it was really inspirational. And that was, again, the first great mentor that I had. I've had others like Michael Crow, who's another amazing mentor, but Judy was just so fierce and so determined. And all that energy just sort of impacted the way I try to lead today, maybe in a slightly different style, but nonetheless with the same sort of determination.
I love this. And before we run, I do feel like the Michael Crow piece, you are the only person I have ever met in American higher education who has known Michael Crow from when he was a young whippersnapper. And if you want to share a tiny anecdote from you met him out in the wild and have known him now this long, and now you're part of the University Innovation Alliance with him, but you knew him way back.
Yeah, no, I met Michael probably around 1988 or 89 or so, and I was on a management consulting project at Iowa State University, and I had just interviewed the president. And after the interview, the president said, if you really want to know what's going on here, go talk to this young guy I just hired, a couple of years ago. So I went downstairs, knocked on his office door, walked in, and a great 35-year friendship began. And I can tell you, he's still the same. He's just a little bit older now, but he's the same exact guy, from like leaping up and drawing on boards and giving me 10 things to read and telling me what to do. It's the same Michael Crow. I love the guy. I can't get enough of him.
He's a part-time librarian, always doling out assignments to everyone. You don't know that you're in his class, but you're in his class.
I was in his class from the very, and I'm still in his class 35 years later.
All right, well, this has been just super lovely. I hope folks at home, you really get a sense of why I just think John is such a treasure, and his insights and perspective are just so unique. And we're so grateful that you shared some of your wisdom and your love of higher ed. I just feel like we get such a clear sense of appreciation and humility for the gift of doing this work. And I think right now when things are kind of challenging, it's really important to call back on that kind of first principle of recognizing the privilege that we're all given. So thank you so much for that and for sharing your insights with us today.
Bridget, thanks so much. Sarah, so nice to meet you. And guys, thanks for giving me the chance. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
See ya.